David, thank you very much indeed. This talk may be a bit of a contrivance, really, but I hope you'll bear with me. It's a contrivance in the sense that as historians, we tend to look self-evidently at the First World War with the benefit of hindsight. And when we look at it with the benefit of hindsight, what we see is how the war looked in 1918, which would, in 20th century terms, self-evidently be called a total war. And indeed, the phrase was first used, I'll come to that at the end of my talk, it was first used in that year. Both sides had fought a war of exhaustion, and they had involved their countries in full-scale national mobilization. And the presumption for most of those nations after 1918 was that this will be the pattern of future war. This was what modern war was like, that it would require full-scale mobilization. It would require the entire population to be involved in one form or another. And in this country, in Britain, people like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart increasingly use the phrase grand strategy to describe the scale of the conflict. This was a conflict, these would be conflicts fought by alliances on multiple fronts, on land, sea and air, and also at home. And even those who hoped that this would be the war to end all wars were invested in this idea of the First World War as a total war, because for the First World War to have been a war that would end all wars, it had to have a deterrent effect. It had to be so awful, of such a scale, and so destructive that the countries in future would be deterred from going to war. Now, I talked about hindsight, and many historians have tended to treat this development as, in inverted commas, inevitable. No professional historian would ever agree, I hope, that anything is actually inevitable. It's normally contingent on a number of factors, as I will come to argue. But when they talk about it being inevitable, they do two things, really. They first of all say, look at the United States, look at the experience of the American Civil War. That was a war that required both North and South to mobilize fully, to involve the whole of society, to involve the full-scale mobilization of the capacities of North and South. And it was from that war that in September 1870, General Phil Sheridan, when he was in Europe, advised Otto von Bismarck, the soon-to-be German Chancellor during the Franco-Prussian War, that as the Prussians besieged Paris, they should make the people suffer. The civilians should have nothing left but their tears to cry with. That, in other words, you had to wage war against the civilian population as well as against the armed forces. And the other point that people make about the inevitability of all this is they refer to the works of Ivan Jan Bloch. He appears under several different names, whether he's being Russian or Polish. He was a Russian Jew living in Poland, or Jean de Bloch, as he becomes, because his work is translated into French. A man who'd written a book on future war in the mid-1890s of enormous scale, 6 volumes, massive volumes, saying that given the level of industrialization in Europe, given the capacity to mobilize economies in Europe, given the level of mass participation, war actually was going to be awful, but therefore also probably wouldn't happen because countries will be self-deterred from going to war. They couldn't afford to fight a war like this. He was wrong, of course. People forget that, that he hadn't actually anticipated the First World War. He had anticipated the First World War wouldn't happen. But the point I would make tonight is that neither of these arguments are neglected at the time. Plenty of European observers go to look at what is happening in the United States between 1861 and 1865. draw conclusions from that. They, of course, are also impressed by the German quick victories in the Franco-Prussian War, and look at that too. So there's a countervailing model, but they don't neglect the American Civil War, and they certainly don't neglect Bloch. I've already said he's translated into French from his native Russian, but he's also translated into English and in a small abridged one-volume version. But that book is debated publicly at the Royal United Services Institute. Nobody disregards what he's saying, principally, of course, because he has an influence on the Tsar Nicholas II when he convenes the Hague peace conferences. So, you know, there is an awareness of this. And of course, it's also reflected in things like the fictional literature of what future war would look like. There's a great growth across all European countries between 1871 and 1914 in this sort of form of science fiction, if you like. What would a future war look like? Having said all that, it still remains true that in professional military education, right up until 1914, at the Staff College in Britain, at the École de Guerre in France, at the Kriegsacademy in Germany, there was a tendency to look back rather than to look forwards. To look back certainly to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, but also, even more, still to hold dear to the memory of the last Great War, the war against revolutionary France and Napoleon. And that occupied people's thoughts as the shape that a truly great war could take. In Germany and in Britain, two famous students of war criticized that interpretation of future war, that it would be on a great scale. One of those critics was really the founder of modern military history, a German professor of universal history at Berlin University, a man who'd had himself served in the Franco-Prussian War, Hans Delbrück, who wrote a 4-volume history of war in its political context between 1890 and 1920. Hans Delbrück said that war could be of two kinds. It could either be a war of annihilation, a war where one side aimed to achieve total victory over the other and dictate a peace, or it could be a war of exhaustion, a war of exhaustion not through battle as the First World War was to be, but through maneuver. What he argued was that Frederick the Great, in the 7 Years' War, had confronted on all sides of Prussia by a coalition of France, Austria, and Russia, had endeavored to maneuver between these three armies so that they could never bring their forces to bear at the same place and at the same time. The war had become protracted, but in the end, they had become exhausted too, and so Prussia had survived. And this was a war, if you like, for more limited objectives. Interestingly, I mean, he called this Ermattungskrieg, a war of attrition. But as I've said, he didn't mean attrition in the sense in which it came to be understood in the First World War. The other major critic of this idea that there had to be a major war if there were future war in Europe was a Brit, Julian Corbett, the author of some principles of maritime strategy, published in 1911, a lawyer by training with no direct service of his own, but a man who, through his interest in naval history and his studies of maritime strategy, made a number of important distinctions which are relevant to this debate. First of all, he distinguished between major war and limited war. One of the principal arguments in his book, published in 1911, in the year of the Second Moroccan Crisis, in the year in which Lloyd George thought storm clouds were gathering over Europe, one of his observations was that in earlier wars, it had been possible for Britain as an island nation, to be able to take only a limited part of the major wars in Europe in which they have been engaged. In other words, Britain in particular could fight a limited war within a major war. And therefore, there was a distinction to be made in strategic terms between fighting a major war and fighting a more limited war. Now, both these people, with their binary visions of war, either a major war or a more limited war, both these people were reviled for their efforts. In Germany, the Prussian General Staff historical branch was outraged by Delbrück's suggestion that Frederick the Great had not sought battle in the 7 Years' War. After all, he'd won 2 great victories in 1757 against the French at Rossbach and against the Austrians at Leuthen. He clearly was a seeker after battle. And they wanted to see Frederick the Great as the precursor of Napoleon, not as a contrast to Napoleon, as a man who did fight wars of annihilation, because for them, that was the ideal model. And they failed to understand that in some ways what Delbrück was saying was this idea of a war of exhaustion was actually in a way a political choice. You know, given Prussia's limited resources against an alliance of 3 opponents, it couldn't fight a war on the same scale. The dispute between Delbrück and the Prussian General Staff continued right up until the outbreak of the First World War, and interestingly enough, it will be renewed after the First World War. In Britain, when Corbett published some principles of maritime strategy, that was published in 1911, and it was reviewed by Spencer Wilkinson, former journalist and then the Zechlin Professor of Military History, as it was then called, at Oxford, who described it as a book that should not on any account be put into the hands of a young naval officer because it would lead him astray. He would fail to understand the importance of fleet action. He would fail to understand the need to fight major war. And given the context of 1911, given the context of the Second Moroccan crisis, you could see why Wilkinson was concerned about this attempt to downplay the possibility of major war. Both Delbrück and Corbett, for all their differences, one German, one British, one talking about land warfare, one talking about war at sea, had one point in common, and that is their inspiration was Karl von Clausewitz. In Clausewitz's On War, there is a prefatory note written on the 10th of July, 1827, 4 years before Clausewitz died, in which he said, war can be of 2 kinds. It can either be a war designed to overthrow the enemy, with the result that he is annihilated and that he is rendered defenseless, or it can be the sort of war which ends with a negotiated settlement, a border rectification, and essentially an agreement rather than dictated peace. The dictated peace would be the result of the first sort of war, and the second, as I said, would be a form of negotiation. So all 3 writers, Clausewitz, Delbrück, Corbett, recognized that although major war might hog the limelight in military history, it was not the whole story. It was a realization Clausewitz himself had come to when he thought about his own experience, which was in the Napoleonic Wars, and contrasted that with the 18th century, where he realized wars had been more limited. And it was that very realization which made him think, if I'm going to write a universal study of war, I have to allow for the fact that war could be limited. Now, the problem is much more than our tendency to be swayed by hindsight, our knowledge that this war, which breaks out in 1914, will become a total war, a major war, rather than more limited war. It leaves out of account the fact that when students of war look back on the experience of the 19th century, they were looking back over a century in which, on the whole, wars had remained limited. I mean, the last Great War was 100 years before, but that didn't mean there hadn't been other wars in Europe. There had been other wars in Europe, but those wars had, broadly speaking, been contained. Even the German wars of unification were often described as Kabinettskrieg, a cabinet war, a war where the negotiations between governments carried out at political level were really comparatively civilized compared with what might have been, and which did end with political resolutions and political negotiations. And the other thing that in terms of immediate precedent that was enormously powerful in all this was that between the end of the Crimean War in 1856, which had been settled in negotiations in Paris, and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, international law governing war had grown exponentially. In Paris in 1856, an agreement had been reached about the conduct of war at sea. Privateering had been abolished, attempts had been made to define contraband, and so on and so forth. And between then and the two Hague conferences at the turn of the century and then in 1907, there were attempts to ratify agreements about the conduct of war on land, to recognize that there was, you needed to recognize non-combatant immunity, you needed to recognize the rights of civilians, but also you needed to recognize the rights of belligerents, that soldiers, if they were captured, could be treated as prisoners of war and had certain rights as a consequence of that. And underpinning all this on the part of international law was some hope that actually war could be negotiated away, that not just could you contain war through law, but you could also prevent war from happening in the first place. That if you could only create a legal order that made the resort to war itself illegal, then that would prevent war. And of course, that movement would come to fruition initially in 1928 with the Calais-Briand Pact, and then after 1945 with the United Nations Charter. And I stress this point because during the First World War itself, when there were debates between the two sides on a number of issues about the conduct of the submarine campaign or the conduct of Britain's blockade against Germany, debates about how you could treat prisoners of war, whether they could work within battlefield zones or not, how much labor they could do, could they be used for military purposes in producing munitions, and all these sorts of debates. That these were conducted through the legal departments of the respective foreign ministries. Law had sufficient hold in the way in which the European states were behaving, on the way in which European states were behaving, that actually they provide common vocabulary. And indeed, one of the reasons why Germany responded so vociferously to the accusation that German soldiers had committed atrocities in Belgium in 1914 was in part that it recognized that if that were true, Germany had breached international law, had killed civilians out of hand, and of course, therefore had to show either these people were fighting, they were francs-tireurs, or to show that military necessity, the great defense of armed forces, which the legal system left them, still required them to behave in this way. So here is a framework in which actually, come 1914, there's no necessary expectation that this Great War will be like the last Great War, that this Great War will be, as Clausewitz himself had described it, an absolute war, or would it be something less than that? I mean, Clausewitz himself asked the question in On War. He said, you know, if we look back at the Napoleonic Wars, we expect future war in Europe to be of the same scale, but we don't know. And for him to expect that when he was writing in the 1820s was fair enough. But if you looked at it from the perspective of the 1890s or even from the 1850s, you might have come to a different conclusion, because the wars had been largely bilateral between two states, sometimes involving more, but even when they involve more, they tended to be regionally confined. So here we have an expectation that war does not have to be major, does not have to be a ground war. And then we have a further problem, which is that those historians who argued that the First World War was inevitable, to use that word again, because Germany was planning to establish its world dominance, because Germany egged on Austria-Hungary in July 1914 to go to war. Those historians currently have been put back in their box. The current argument, embodied above all by books like Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers, but also by a range of books, particularly on Austria-Hungary's role in the precipitation of this war, would say actually, just as Lloyd George argued in the 1930s, or American historians like Sidney Fay argued in the late 1930s, Europe slithered over the brink. This was a cock-up, not a conspiracy. There was no inevitability. They would argue that, if only it hadn't been in the summer and it had come in the autumn, and the diplomats had been all at their posts rather on holiday, and there'd been really time for negotiation, the war wouldn't have happened. So we have here a sort of one pressure saying the war is inevitable, it's going to be like this, and it's going to be massive, and another set of arguments that says it's not going to be like this, or it doesn't have to be like this, and it might not even happen at all. So the question that I now want to go to is, if we for a moment, and I know not all of you will agree with Christopher Clark's work, and we can talk about that, but but I've argued very similarly in my own work on the First World War, in my first volume of what's meant to be 3-volume history of the First World War, that Germany does not have a major role in precipitating it in the way in which Fritz Fischer and others argued, or indeed in the way in which the peacemakers in 1919 argued in the War Guilt Clause. We have this issue of explaining how did the war escalate, and escalate so quickly? How did it become a major war so speedily and so seemingly out of control? Now, one answer has been given to this question and has looked at another antecedent to 1914, has said, what are these armies doing before 1914? And they look in particular to colonial warfare, because in colonial warfare, some of the behaviors manifested in the First World War and in our understanding of total war can get freer expression. That the atrocities committed in Belgium and northern France, or by the Austro-Hungarians in Serbia, or by the Russians in East Prussia, eroded the distinctions between combatant and non-combatant, and made war as an active force against an undifferentiated other, just as imperial powers had treated native populations in this way, had attacked the entire way of life of those they were fighting. The French had done this in Algeria. The British had done it in suppressing the Indian in 1857. They'd done it against the Zulus in 1879. The Germans had done it East and Southwest Africa. I don't buy this argument. I think it's far-fetched, but I'll just make 2 points to explain why I don't think this explains why the First World War reached the scale it did. First of all, most of the troops who fought in Europe in 1914 had no direct experience of colonial warfare. The average German conscript going into Belgium had never been anywhere near a German colony before 1914, was too young to have done anything like that. And the same, Austria-Hungary hadn't got an overseas empire. It was a European empire, and its soldiers were in the same position. That did not stop them from committing atrocities. Moreover, the colonial troops brought by countries like Britain and France from their empires, the Indian troops who came to France in 1914, the Senegalese and the North Africans who came to France in the First World War to fight for France, arrived after the war had already reached the sort of scale we're talking about. In other words, they bear no responsibility, despite often their use by German propaganda to suggest they did commit atrocities, to suggest they actually did. If this colonial argument were true, then you would actually expect the French and above all the British countries with whose soldiers had recent experience of colonial service, and that was particularly true of the British Expeditionary Force, made up of nearly half reservists, many of whom had medals from colonial campaigns. You'd expect them to be the committers of atrocity, but they don't commit atrocities that we know of, partly, of course, because they're fighting a defensive battle in 1914. They're not in Germany, perhaps, but even so, there are no atrocities to pin on them. The second concern is that if you look at the doctrines of these European armies before 1914, and the way in which those doctrines approach the laws of war, they make a clear distinction between what they called civilized war and so-called uncivilized war. Uncivilized war was what went on in the colonies, where indeed there was very little respect for the distinction between competent and non-competent, where you did attack a way of life and so on and so forth. And civilized war was what Europeans did to each other because they obeyed the laws of war. They obeyed the Hague Conventions and so on, and they respected the rights of prisoners, and they would try not to attack civilians and non-combatants. And in some ways, I think we've actually got this argument the wrong way around. I would argue that European powers learn uncivilized war in Europe in 1914-18, and then go and apply it in the colonies after 1918. And that the obvious case, which many have cited before, is the example of strategic bombing. Those who argue in favor of war already being awful before 1914 refers to the Italian use of air attack on Libyans in the Italian invasion of Libya in 1911. I see no reference or indication that there is any direct connection between that experience in Libya and the use of air power in the First World War by the principal belligerents. On the other hand, there is clear evidence, particularly in Britain, that the use of air power in the First World War in 1918 made the advocates of air power aware of how people on the ground could be influenced and frightened by the use of air attack. And this becomes, in the British Empire, in Iraq, on the northwest frontier of India in the early 1920s, known as air control. How do you control a large area simply and easily? Well, you go and bomb a few villages because you know the belligerent tribesmen are in those villages, and if you destroy their houses and their families and their crops or destroy their livestock, you will destroy their capacity to fight. In Waziristan in 1919, that point was made quite explicit. There was no warning given to the tribespeople in their villages before they were bombed. And it's worth actually bearing in mind, in 1919 itself, in the Third Afghan War, the RAF bombed Kabul, first bombing of a city. These were all ideas that they had been working on in France in 1918, the growth of an independent bombing force. It then happens in the empire, and then the argument runs on that among those who experienced this are Charles Portal and Arthur Harris of Bomber Command, Charles Portal, Chief of the Air Staff, and it therefore has repercussions into the Second World War. So we have, before 1940 and in 1914, both portents and anticipations of what we might anachronistically call, because these phrases were not current in 1914, either total war or limited war. There are precedents for both of these things in European history before 1914. And so both are options in 1914. When the war breaks out, in the run-up to the outbreak of war, we can see both ideas running. To give you one really striking example of this ambivalence, Konrad von Hötzendorf, the Austro-Hungarian chief of the general staff, was a social Darwinist. In other words, he believed the states were either rising or declining, and that they would fight as they passed each other on this ascension or descension. And therefore, he saw war as existential for the state, and he argued in particular that the Habsburg monarchy, which he served, would at some stage have to fight for its survival. So that's his mindset. That's how he thinks about war, that's how he thinks about strategy. But then look at his behavior in the July crisis after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo. He is pushing in the Crown Council for war, but the war for which he is pushing is a war against Serbia alone. It's a limited war, an Austro-Hungarian Serb war. That's what the Germans are buying into too, which will reassert Austria-Hungary in the Balkans, and from which Austria-Hungary hope to create a new Balkan coalition that would be more favorable to the Habsburg Empire, led by Bulgaria, because Serbia would be crushed. What Konrad is doing while the July crisis is unfolding is not bothering to look at the behavior of Russia. Russia responds to the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum to Serbia immediately and threatens the use of military action. Austria-Hungary has a war plan for this, which means that if it is fighting both on its Russian front and on its Serb front, it will have to divide its army between the two fronts. But that is not the war plan that Konrad mobilizes his army for. He mobilizes it initially for the war against Serbia only. And then by the time he does respond to the Russian mobilization, he is too late. In other words, the war he is now looking at, despite all his talk of an existential war for the empire, is a limited war against Serbia. Look at Britain. When Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, stands up in Parliament to explain to members of Parliament how the crisis in Europe has developed, on the 3rd of August 1914, the House is wrapped, caught up in the events. This is meant to be one of the great parliamentary moments when he delivers this speech. It is already known that Britain does stand on the brink of war because Germany has invaded Belgium. And what he says is, quoting him, "For us, with a powerful fleet, which we believe able to protect our commerce and protect our shores, and to protect our interests if we are engaged in war, we shall suffer but little more than we shall suffer even if we stand aside." In other words, the war which Grey says Britain will be committing itself to is a limited war. Britain will take a limited part because it will use sea power in a major war. It's an argument straight out of Corbett, whom Grey knew and whose work he read in some principles of maritime strategy. Britain will use its position as an offshore island in relation to the European continent to contain its contribution, while Germany itself, while remaining itself, territorially inviolate. And in the same speech, Grey said he thought the British Expeditionary Force would be used not to go to France, but would be used to protect Britain's empire. But he too, like Konrad, was ambivalent, because having said that, having given this vision of what Britain's war would be like, Grey said in his speech, evoked in his speech, a much more awful vision. He said, and to quote him again, "We are in the presence of a European conflagration. Can anybody set limits to the consequences that may arise out of it?" In other words, it's going to be unlimited. And that night, he is alleged to have said, as he saw the lamplighter going along the London streets, the lamps are going out all over Europe. So he's harboring two visions simultaneously, just like Conrad is. And this ambivalence was evident even in Berlin, most obviously reflected in the suggestion made by the Kaiser, made far too late, but made when the Kaiser realized that the crisis was getting out of control and that the chance of a quick Austro-Hungarian victory in Serbia was disappearing because the war was escalating. He said, let the Austro-Hungarian army halt in Belgrade and then we'll negotiate. That's his position. He's drawing back at that point. Look at the far more influential voice of Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, the German chancellor. In the run-up to the crisis, he used, when talking of war, he used the words of existential war. Ein Existenzkampf, ein Weltkrieg, he said, a struggle for existence, a world war. So, you know, his vision of future war in Europe is indeed awful. But then, as he goes through the July crisis, as he realizes that's what's confronting Germany, he too tried to limit it. Kurt Riesler, his private secretary, kept a diary throughout the July crisis. And his diary suggests a chancellor who saw the July crisis as a moment to force the pace of foreign policy by trying to fracture the Triple Entente rather than as a moment for war. What he hoped to do was actually, if there were a limited war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, that would be kept contained as a Balkan war, but the alliance of Britain, France, and Russia, which he saw as encircling Germany, would fragment as a consequence. Konrad Jarausch, who has written a biography of Bethmann-Hollweg, in his chapter on the July crisis, calls it the illusion of limited war. That illusion was alive and well in Berlin in July 1914. The interior minister, Clemens von Delbrück, no relation to Hans Delbrück, said, in case of warlike complications between Austria and Serbia, the Chancellor in Jagau, who's the foreign minister, believed it would be possible to localize the conflagration. The image here, again, is of both ideas, limited and major war, running alongside each other. On the 9th of September 1914, with the Battle of the Marne just reaching its crisis, Bethmann-Hollweg then produced a significant document in the history of the First World War, the first statement of German war aims in this conflict, in which he talked about annexations and control of territory to east and west of Germany. And he talked about the economic control of these areas. Fritz Fischer, the man who's argued most strongly in Germany for Germany being responsible for the outbreak of the First World War, saw this as the clinching evidence which linked pre-war German policy in July 1914, the pursuit of the crisis to its denouement, with the war itself, and as evidence that there was no intention to fight a limited war. His next door neighbor at the University of Hamburg, Egmont Zechlin, disagreed with Fischer utterly. He wrote an article which argued that the War Aims program of September 1919 was Bethmann-Hollweg's response to the realization that this was not, after all, a limited war, not, after all, not a Kabinettskrieg, and then instead what was happening was a war which, because of Britain's entry, would be long, would be an economic war as well as a war fought with the use of armed force, which would make it, in inverted commas, a total war, and therefore required Germany to think how it could marshal the resources to fight such a war, and it could only do that by controlling the resources of its immediate neighbors to its east and west. That trend, this ambivalence about the war, did not simply stop in the autumn of 1914 as the war escalated. The debates, as already mentioned, over international law continued throughout the war. The atrocity debate, which fueled so much of the propaganda of both sides, continued throughout the war. And was an important part in persuading the United States that it should enter this war. This idea, I mean, it didn't enter the war because of Belgian atrocities, but certainly the image of Germany as a militarist power which had done terrible things in Germany was an important part of that. The conduct of operations, even in 1916, it is interesting to see how Falkenhayn, the then chief of the Prussian General Staff, plans the Battle of Verdun, and how Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, responds to it. Falkenhayn chooses to attack at Verdun because it is a limited sector. He wants to limit the number of troops he commits. He therefore attacks at a salient which is not in danger of being immediately outflanked, so that he can contain the size of the battle. And Joffre, who's in the middle of planning what will become the Battle of the Somme as the joint Anglo-French major offensive in 1916 on the Western Front, responds by trying to abandon Verdun, not defend it, not defend this salient. He only has to defend it because of political pressure. And even when he does have to defend it, he says to Philippe Pétain, put in charge of the defense of Verdun, that he's going to limit the number of troops that go through the battlefield because he needs to keep French manpower intact for the bigger offensive. And I think the biggest argument that in some ways shows this trend to try and limit the war is how the war aims debate develops. Because none of the original belligerents in 1914 had a program of war aims, developed program of war aims. People don't go to war in the rush of July 1914 for reasons of calculation, long-term calculation. They go because of the short-term exigencies that they confront. By contrast, those powers that enter the war after July 1914 do consider their options and do set their conditions. And the point about the war aims that they develop is that these are geographically defined. These are Clausewitz's frontiers that are going to be negotiated, a territorial adjustment. Japan is the most conspicuous example. Japan enters the war in August 1914, at the end of August 1914, and it's very clear that it's using this opportunity to become a major power in the North Pacific and to establish increase its foothold on the Asian mainland in Manchuria and into China itself. That's exactly what it does. It resists vehemently any pressure to involve it in the greater war within Europe. And other countries that follow, the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria from the point of view of the Central Powers, and a raft of other belligerents, Romania, Greece, Italy, from the point of view of the Entente powers, and many more, enter with very clear regional geographical objectives. They want immediate acquisitions. These are negotiable propositions. This is not a war for civilization, not a war for the rule of law or any of the big ideas of 1914. Perhaps the most extreme example is China's decision to enter the war. China enters the war in order to be at the peace settlement, not to fight the war at all, because of course it wants to respond to Japan. Now, I've made the case for this being seen as a limited war till quite late in the war. But of course, there's a danger of being absurd, getting ridiculously overridden here, because this war doesn't remain a limited war. So in the limited time I've got left, let me just say why I think this becomes a major war and what drives it. There is one immediate pressure, and that is that actually it's very hard to negotiate a settlement. Colonel House comes in 1915 to represent Woodrow Wilson, the American president, tries to negotiate a settlement, but can't. And he can't because the military position of the Entente powers, particularly France, is too weak with so much territory under German occupation for them to be able to negotiate the sort of peace they would like. And in 1916 itself, Woodrow Wilson, when he tries to negotiate after Verdun on the Somme, which you think might have prompted the powers to agree to terms, finds that there is no basis for negotiation. And the concern, until the Entente powers have a stronger military position, is that all the Germans are trying to do in negotiate is to break Russia away from the Entente powers by doing a separate deal with them. In other words, the peace negotiations will just be a way of conducting the war. But the real big change in this war comes from the idea of revolution. It comes with the incorporation of war and revolution under one heading. During the last Great War, the Napoleonic Wars, revolution in France had led to major war across Europe that had lasted more than 20 years. And when the peacemakers met at Vienna in 1815, they were quite clear that in order to preserve the international order, they needed to separate revolution from war, that if there were revolution, it would lead to war. After the 1848 revolutions across Europe, the fear of revolution declined. It still continued, but more importantly, what happened was that revolutions occurred without being caused by, war happened without revolutions having precipitated them. So the Crimean War did not break out because of the 1848 revolutions. If revolution occurred, as it occurred, for example, in France, in the Commune, after the end of the Franco-Prussian War, or as occurred in Russia in 1905, it happened as a consequence of war. But even then, war didn't always precipitate revolution. There was no revolution in Austria after the defeat of 1866, although it did, of course, produce a constitutional reordering with the creation of Austria-Hungary. What that meant was that in many people's minds, this fear that revolution would lead to war had gone away. What is striking in 1914 itself, in July 1914 itself, is that many feared that war would lead to revolution. The Tsar feared it, Bethmann-Hollweg feared it, Sir Edward Grey feared it. They all saw the potential for this war to lead to revolution. But what is really staggering is, despite that fear, many of them then proceeded to use revolution as a way of undermining their opponents. So the Kaiser said in July 1914, we must take war essentially across the British and French empires. Britain at least must lose India. We must provoke a holy war. And Moltke, the then chief of the general staff, supported him. This idea of jihad, which is pushed forward by the alliance with the Ottoman Empire, which enables Germany to be the representative Muslim powers, but also includes the possible undermining of Russia through appealing to the nationalities within the Russian Empire, the Baltic states, and many other peoples, many of whom have Germanic links, are appealed to by Germany. But it's not all on one side, this. Britain, when it uses the blockade, increasingly comes to see blockade as an instrument to cause revolution within Germany. Britain enters in contact with Sharif Hussein of Mecca at the end of 1914, which is the path that leads to the Arab Revolt, made famous, of course, by T. Lawrence, to topple the Ottoman Empire. And the French government, from the very beginning of this war, uses the vocabulary of its own revolution of 1789, and particularly the vocabulary of 1793, to mobilize the country for war. Now, revolution creates a fear from within. Revolution reintroduces the practices of irregular war, or indeed colonial war, if you want to see it in those terms, in places like the Balkans, of course, across the Ottoman Empire with the Arab Revolt and so on. But it puts a premium on the idea initially of national mobilization. It puts a premium on the idea that peoples will rally to the nation in order to enable the war to be sustained. What happens initially in this war is the pre-war strength of socialism, which has grown as a force across Europe before 1914, largest party in Germany in 1914 as the Socialist Party, is then enlisted for the purposes of social and economic mobilization. What the war delivers is full mobilization for the economy, full employment. The trades unions collude in this national mobilization. They become partners in government rather than opponents of government. And in a way, initially, this element of socialist involvement is an instrument for counter-revolution, for uniting the country, for making everybody feel they're all Frenchmen, or as the Kaiser put it, I see only Germans, the end of internal division. And the insurgents, when they appear, are those fighting for national independence. If there were insurgents in Belgium in 1914, Front Terreur, or indeed in France, they were fighting for the defense of their country, just as the Chetniks were doing the same in Serbia against the Austrians. The change comes in 1917, when, after the Russian Revolution, the insurgents become the standard bearers of revolution rather than of nationalism. The Germans, carrying on their policy of promoting revolution, smuggle Lenin into Petrograd, and the revolution ends up subverting Russia and taking Russia out of the war by the end of 1917. Even more alarmingly, the United States in 1917 enters a bidding war with the Russian Bolsheviks in order to claim the responsibility for fighting a war for democracy, for fighting a war for the rights of national groupings. Ironically, it is the United States' entry in April 1917, and particularly Woodrow Wilson's 14 points of January 1918, which are used as ways of taking this revolutionary move one step further on, because by promising national self-determination, you undermine the four major multinational empires within Europe: Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. So American entry and its call for democracy carries the revolutionary further one step further. When the war ends in November 1918, it does not end precisely because revolution has been let out of the bag. Beatrice Webb, on Armistice Day, November 1918, wrote in her diary, "Thrones are everywhere crashing, and the men of property are secretly trembling. How soon will the tide of revolution catch up with the tide of victory? There is a question, that is a question which is exercising at Whitehall and Buckingham Palace, and which is causing anxiety even among the more thoughtful Democrats. Will it be 6 months or a year?" Well, the reality is it was much sooner, but also much longer, because the next 4 years saw the war continue in the shape of revolution, civil war, of Reds versus Whites, and of the pursuit of the objectives in ideological terms, which tied ideology to nationalism and made it extraordinarily hard to bring this war back under control. Final word. Of course, total war has an economic and social aspect. Of course, new weapons transformed how this war was fought. But it's important to remember these were enablers, not ends. The real drivers for war's expansion were political and ideological. And the irony was that this had been triggered by the very people in 1914 who had sought ways at least at times and in part, to limit war. And what they did to war then created an opportunity in 1918, which was embraced by revolutionaries on the one side, but also on the other by the radical right. I said I'd come back to the last the first use of the word total war, phrase total war. That was coined by Léon Daudet of the Action Française, of the radical right proto-fascist newspaper, who wrote a book in early 1918 called La Guerre Totale, and who includes the definition of total war. It's the sort of vocabulary used too by Douay as he develops his arguments about air power in 1921, which will be picked up by Mussolini and the fascists. And of course, it's embodied in the book by Erich Ludendorff, the first quartermaster general of the German army, when in 1935 he wrote a book called Der totale Krieg. When that book was translated in the same year into English, under the title of The Nation at War, Der totale Krieg, the total war, was translated as totalitarian war. This was the sort of war which totalitarian states waged. And in Germany in particular, the arguments of Clausewitz that war had a binary nature, that war could be a total war, a major war, a war of annihilation, or a more limited war, were thrown out. A man called Schering, a Nazi, a philosopher, wrote a book in 1938. He was a man who worked on Clausewitz, and who said, the notion that there are two sorts of war no longer applies. War now is only total war. War is a war. War is something that involves the whole of society, and it's a matter of existence. Either you survive or you go down, victory or collapse. Stark alternatives, no negotiated way out. Thank you very much.
Tremendous. Thanks ever so much indeed, Hew, for that extremely illuminating and interesting presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd care to raise your hands in the usual way as a virtual round of applause for Hew Strachan for that, I will pass on to him the fact that what we have is hundreds of hands being raised as a silent, I'm afraid, in these circumstances, silent round of applause. So thanks very much. If anybody's got questions for Hew, please tap them into the Q&A button that you'll see underneath your screen. We already have quite a number of questions that have come along. So, John Williams.
Hew, great, really great presentation, and having just embarked upon an MA in First World War Studies with Gary Sheffield up at Wolves. It was a must, and it would have been great if you could have done it 3 weeks ago. Just a thought, and on my recent readings, is your view really on Lloyd George's involvement in promoting this concept of total war within Britain, sort of 16, 17. I'd just be interested in that.
Yeah.
An essay I might do it.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, by then, it is clear. I mean, Lloyd George, if you look at the sort of limited war argument in Britain, when Lloyd George's Ministry of Munitions, well, initially Chancellor of the Exchequer, then Ministry of Munitions, McKenna, who succeeds him as Chancellor of the Exchequer, says, and who's been First Lord of the Admiralty in his time, says, you know, we can either afford to fight a naval war, which involves the use of the British economy, which means we have to continue to be able to export, to be able to bring in resources from the rest of the world, and not raise a mass army. Or if we raise a mass army, we will not be able to fund this war and fight a naval war. We can't do both. And that's a real debate for the cabinet in 1915. Lloyd George's answer to that problem when he becomes prime minister is, we do both. So you're right. I mean, Lloyd George's commitment, and Georges Clemenceau is very much of the same persuasion. I mean, it happens later in France when Clemenceau becomes premier in November 1917. Somewhat bizarrely, Clemenceau is a socialist. Daudet is despite his right-wing credentials, admires what Clemenceau has done, because Clemenceau says everybody's in this fight. We're all going to fight. So yes, Lloyd George doesn't use the vocabulary of total war, but he is certainly using the rhetoric in terms of national mobilization and expecting the war to be fought to the finish and without negotiation. I mean, he has interior doubts. We know from those who are close to Lloyd George, when Lansdowne produces his letter saying this is absurd, we're killing European civilization by doing this. Lloyd George condemns him publicly in November 1917, but privately, of course, he is just as concerned as everybody else is by the way the war is going and the damage that's being done.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question there, John.
Thanks, David.
Sorry, I don't know your first name. G. Evans.
Hi, it's Graham Evans.
Hi, Graham.
You. Thank you, Hugh. I was a student of the RCDS and we met once or twice and you did some fantastic lectures, so a big fan of you. Thank you for that. My question is regarding Edward Grey. Could Edward Grey have done more to stop the First World War happening between the United Kingdom and Germany if he'd let the Germans know categorically that we would have declared war and defend Belgium neutrality? Do you think it was inevitable, but could he have done more to be clear, to make clear to the Germans?
He couldn't, because he was politically too constrained. I mean, the problem is that if he does that any earlier than he does do it, his party will split. The cabinet will split. The cabinet is evenly divided for and against war right up until the 1st of August, 2nd of August. So there's not much he can say. He's only too well aware. What he doesn't want to do is, the other concern he has, is if he makes a firm commitment to, and a public commitment to Russia and to France, that will encourage them to behave in more bellicose ways in their response to Germany and Austria-Hungary. So he's fearful that because there is a very tight alliance between France and Russia, and because they do actually have war plans which make each dependent on the capabilities of the other, that if he, not that he necessarily knows the full detail of those, but that he will give them a license to behave irresponsibly. So he's having to hedge bets at every level, really. He hopes that Germany will enter negotiations in the Balkan crisis. At the end of the First Balkan War, Germany and Britain had got together and had got the powers together and essentially ended the war. And Grey has been encouraged by that and thinks that can happen again. So he's still hoping that. So he's really, his position is exposed at the moment the Germans say we're not negotiating.
Thank you.
And they, yeah.
Thank you.
So I mean, your short answer is, I think if there had been a clear indication from Britain as to what it was doing, it would probably have stopped Germany in its tracks. But there can be no clear commitment because Grey's not in a position to give that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. Thanks for your question there, Graham. Angela Hall.
Yep.
Oh, Angela, hello, you're now live.
Yes, I'm live now, thank you, yeah. I'm an indexer of military history books. I do general indexing, but military history is my main subject in, subject specialism. And I come across the name of Clausewitz regularly. And I just wondered how much the doctrines of Clausewitz influenced the participants on either side within the First World War, or if there is any evidence to actually, determine that.
Yeah. Well, he by 1914, I mean, before 1870-71, Clausewitz has very limited circulation outside Germany. He's first translated into French in the 1850s. The first English translations not until the early 1870s. He's not translated into Russian until 1905, I think. So it's certainly not until 1871. He is more widely read after 1871, partly because he is a German or Prussian, and the Prussian success in 1870-71 makes him more fashionable. The trouble with Clausewitz is the whole argument is designed to help you to understand war. And the result is there are contradictory statements. I mean, the point I picked up on, which is war can be of two kinds. It can be a war of annihilation, or it can be a war that leads to a negotiated settlement, illustrates it perfectly. It doesn't give you an answer as to what sort of war you're going to confront in the next war that you fight. And that's part of the problem. At every point when Clausewitz says something, somewhere in the text, there's a contradictory position. So he's certainly much more widely read in the run-up to 1914. But he tends to be read in terms of saying, because he is describing initially, at least, his own experience in the Napoleonic Wars, in describing major war, in describing strategy as bringing battle about and the decisive battle about, as therefore conforming to the major war narrative, even though he himself saw war as being possible in a lesser form. He is not immediately before the First World War, the person that people are actually reading is a man called Ben Hardy, who wrote a 2-volume work in 1912 called On War of Today, Vom Kriege, Vom heutigen Kriege. So that's a deliberate attempt to sort of take Clausewitz's title and bring it up to date. So if people want what they think Germany is currently thinking, that's the book that they read. But it also shows very clearly where Clausewitz has been put by them. A lot of the innuendo, the uncertainty, the debate has been taken out in terms of favor of greater certainty.
That's great, thank you. And thank you for the most riveting talk I've ever had on the First World War.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. Thanks very much. Right, Roger.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Hugh, for a fascinating talk. I'm just wondering to what extent you think that in the final weeks of the summer of 1914, that the mobilization process and particularly the complexities of the railway timetables, and in particular for Russia and for Germany, meant that war was going to be inevitable because neither power could afford to be the last one to mobilize.
I think by the time the mobilization gets underway, the war is already going to happen. I mean, there's certainly going to be a limited local regional war in Serbia by the time the mobilization begins. I'm talking the mobilization apart from mobilization of the Austria-Hungarian army. But of course, that's a delayed mobilization anyway, because they're struggling to get. But once because the mobilization orders at the very end of July are past the point of the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum to Serbia. They're past the point where Russia has already taken a decision to respond. They're past the point where Germany knows that if Russia acts, it's going to have to act. So I think, I do think politics have led you. I don't think, for all Alan Taylor saying this, I don't think it was war by railway timetable. What is true is that, particularly for Austria-Hungary, the cost of its mobilization during the Balkan Wars have been such, and this is made very clear to the Crown Council, have been such that they could not afford to mobilize again, because it costs a lot of money to bring all these soldiers in, give them their kit and get them ready to go off to war, and not use them. Repeated mobilizations were depleting the resources of the state. And of course, the complexity of mobilizing Russia, as you say, is so great that that is a significant factor there too. But the argument that has indeed been voiced by many, which is if only Moltke had said, oh well, we've got a plan to go east and not to go west, and we aren't caught up in the mobilization timetable, that I think by that point, it's already, the moment's passed. And actually it is irretrievable. And it is significant to go back to a word I used, and a word that Clausewitz himself was very fond of. It's a moment of escalation. The war has assumed a momentum of its own at the point. You're quite right. I mean, there is an element here of escalation, which makes it very hard to draw back at that point. I suppose where I would concede will be the point that once these armies are moving, then obviously you've moved up a step, because a significant step from which is going to be very hard to pull back.
Okay, many thanks.
Thanks for that. Thanks for your question there, Roger. I don't think you've got a video there, James, but if you want to unmute yourself, James. James, your microphone's now live.
Oh, hello there. Yeah, thanks very much. That was a very interesting talk that you did. My only question, was do you think the Germans were the best prepared for any inevitable war in Europe before World War One, and that they were?
It depends.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a sort of circular question, James. I mean, you could say, what sort of war are they preparing for? And it's absolutely true that they probably have, they revise their war plans for both Eastern and Western France every year in a way that other countries don't. So the latest intelligence is always incorporated, and each year, 1911, 1912, 1913, we don't have all these plans, so a lot of them were destroyed by Allied action in by the RAF in 1945. But they did update their plans. But to that extent, they were prepared. Having said that, their army wasn't big enough for the plans that they had, so they were not prepared in that sense. If you, that assumes it's going to be a land war. If you say this is going to be a naval war, well, the answer is Britain's better prepared. You know, the ground fleet is on exercise in July 1914. Churchill takes the decision not to fully demobilize it, to keep the reservists fleet at station, so they're ready to go straight away. Actually, they're readier. But of course, we don't think of it as a land war, a naval war, right? In the same way. We think the land war is the precipitant, and there's some truth in that. But what Germany still isn't adequately prepared for is a war on two fronts. I mean, for all that they've considered that possibility, and indeed from 1913 make it their only possibility, it becomes self-evident that they're not ready to do it. And Moltke, as the Chief of General Staff, is some considerable panic precisely because they're not ready to do it. So it all depends, is the short answer. I'm not giving, or a long answer maybe, what you think for.
No, what I meant was that being prepared, they were deciding that, yeah, there was going to be a war on two fronts, and that they would rather do a quick lightning war against France and against us before they went over to Russia. Yeah. So they were prepared, really, military, better than what we were in France.
Well, yes, except that they do, you know, there are those in the German General Staff who know this is going to be a long war, who realize that they only have the plan for a single campaign, and who realize actually that particularly if Britain's going to be fighting on the Western Front and the British commitment navally and economically is going to protract the war in that direction, that actually they are not sufficiently prepared for that. There's no plan for economic mobilization in Germany. No. That all has to be in August 1914. The army may be ready to go, yes, that's right. But to do what? To achieve a quick early victory in France, but what after that? You know, there's no real looking at second and third order consequences.
No, I just felt.
Thanks for that. Sorry, James. I'm going to.
No, that's fine.
I'm going to move on to
yeah, that's okay.
Nash.
Yeah, thank you very much, though. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello, Christopher. Your microphone's live. Do you want to ask your question?
Okay. Yes. Hello, Hugh.
Hello.
I wonder if the distinction between limited and total war is made irrelevant once warfare technology developed its own momentum. largely outside of political control. In other words, the industrial arms strategy in industry versus what was mainly manpower, shall we say, in the battles pre-1914. So my question is, do these terms really only apply pre-1914?
Well, I mean, you know, the irony is that both limited and total war really get currency after 1945. I mean, the total war is used as a phrase in the interwar period, partly to indicate for Germans what the next war might be like, but also partly as a language of warning, saying, you know, look what happened in the First World War. Do you really want this to happen again? And to act as a deterrent. And you're quite right, a lot of it is to do with weaponry, but actually what's striking, if you read works like, I mean, Douay is concerned with what the bomber can do, so that is a response to technology. But Ludendorff and Daudet, when they write about this, are both looking at political mobilization, social mobilization, more than what weapons can do, more than the destructive effects of modern weaponry. Of course, after 1945, the nuclear weapon changes it completely. Then the technology is determining what you're looking at. You know, as I said in the talk, I quite accept that clearly the destructive effect of modern warfare, which comes out of industrialization, which people have realized is going to have a destructive effect from 1850, when it does clearly change the character of the war and the complexity of the war. But what these politicians and statesmen do by their decision to use revolution is that they enable that means to become unlimited. I mean, we have this destructive power now, but that doesn't mean we use it. You know, that we are able to contain it, partly, of course, because nuclear weapons contain it, and partly because, of course, we've got the experience of the First World War behind us, and we know, you know, and the Second World War too. But I think the means ends thing still matters. But I agree, you know, once you start using gas warfare, then there's pressure to retaliate. Once you start bombing, there's pressure to retaliate. Once you start sinking ships with neutral non-combatants on, there's a pressure to retaliate. So yes, there's an escalatory dynamic in the use of the technology.
Thanks for that. Charles Matheson. Charles, if you just want to unmute yourself there.
You.
Charles?
To what extent do you think that the entry of the United States into the war itself operated as a push towards the totality of the war? Because obviously in the early stages, Britain was inhibited in what it could do by not wanting to upset the United States as the most powerful of neutrals, particularly on the economic warfare front, of the sort of things that I think it's Nicholas Lambert has written about. Obviously, once the United States actually comes into the war, all that falls away. And if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I agree completely. I mean, the gloves are off once the United States is in. Particularly the blockade can be conducted with a ruthlessness which had not been possible before, precisely because the United States is neutral. You know, people in Britain may not be very worried about the opinions of the Dutch or the Swedes or the Danes, who are suffering through being on Germany's borders when they get blockaded. But now you can blockade them because the United States says you can. So yes, absolutely. The war is conducted with a greater ferocity. And actually what's striking about the United States when it comes in, it's such a reluctant belligerent, but once it comes in, it does things far quicker than Britain ever did as the other major democracy entering this war from a distance. You know, Britain takes 2 years to get to conscription. The United States introduces the draft immediately. The United States sets up a really sophisticated propaganda organization immediately. The United States tries to control the economy immediately, in a way in which, for Britain, it had all been a much slower and more protracted process. So yes, I think you're right. I mean, it is frees up others' conduct of the war. Quite apart from, as I said, the effect that the 14 points have in terms of enabling extremist groups in a way that Wilson clearly hadn't intended. He hadn't thought through what he was doing, but enabling extremist groups to say, just like the war on terror, really. I mean, you have, really some pretty dodgy customers associating themselves with the United States after 9/11 in the name of the global war on terror. Well, you have some pretty dodgy customers in the United States' eyes associating themselves with the principles of the 14 points. And those who are trying to preserve some international order are horrified by the consequences of this. But the United States, having not had to be a partner in international order before 1914, are a bit naive about some of it. So yes, I'd agree.
Thanks very much. Thanks for your question, Charles. John Casey, your microphone's live. Hi there, John.
Good evening to you. And thank you for that fascinating talk. And it actually follows on from the point you just made. You talked about the American entry and Wilson's commitment to national self-determination as helping to promote revolution in and undermine the four multinational empires. But would you say it also as promoting the fight for Irish independence?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think, and I should have mentioned, Alan, thank you for raising it. I mean, this story, of course, goes back to the use of revolution as an instrument of war right from the beginning. I mean, Germany itself is ready to support Irish Revolution in 1916, pretty feckless in its endeavours, but the intention is there to run guns in to support the Easter Rising, and the hope of Anglo-Irish. I mean, one of the problems Woodrow Wilson has as president is that here he is fighting an election in November 1916. Shouldn't be talking about presidential elections tonight. This is meant to be a civilized conversation. But anyway, he's fighting an election in November 1916. And he's having to look at all these immigrant communities from Europe who have an interest in this war. Poles who want to be independent, Czechs who want to be free from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and crucially, Irish who want to be out of Britain or the United Kingdom. And he can't afford to disregard them in the way in which he behaves. I mean, the Irish issue, I don't think it's important in American politics, absolutely. But of course, fortunately for Britain, most of the Irish, until after the war, are ready to support the Allied war effort. I mean, the Irish nationalists themselves in 1914, Tom Kettle and Redmond and others, they go off to fight for Britain because they say, we might not like the British Empire and what Britain stands for, but at the moment, because Britain stands for democracy and the rule of law and other things, we are prepared to fight for Britain in this war, and we'll have our reckoning afterwards. So it's a question of how the reckoning is paid out afterwards, which is crucially important. And that, I think, when it comes to the crunch, of course, the United States has become so self-absorbed in that point by the issue of whether it's ratifying the Versailles Agreement and whether it's going to be the League of Nations and Woodrow Wilson's own state of health, and then indeed the 1920 presidential election, that is the point, presumably, when, and I don't know enough about the 1920 election, when presumably the Irish vote begins to matter again.
Thank you very much.
Super, thanks for your question.
That's a good answer, I'm afraid.
Thanks. Michael, your microphone's live, off you go.
Yeah, hi Hugh, thanks very much for your presentation, it was really good, appreciate that. I'm interested in the perspective from the Oriental point of view. You mentioned Japan and the fact that they came into the war with specific war aims, but is there any evidence of how their view on total war, limited war, manifests itself, and was there anything learnt from the Russo-Japanese war in relation to any of that.
Yes, it's, I mean, it's interesting how Japan's interpreted, because in 1905, Japan really precipitates this war. I mean, they say they gave Russia due notice, but they go to war without declaring war, which shocks a lot of people at the time in 1905. And then, of course, proceed to win it in pretty unequivocal terms. And the Americans step in and broker the peace. Russia initially being reluctant to do so. In fact, the peace negotiations go on for some time. So it's surprising in some ways that Japan gets as much support as it does internationally for its behavior in that war. It gets it, I think, because there are enough people who don't like Russia that they remember Britain is still worried. Britain's not yet an ally of Russia in 1905. It will be by 1907, thanks to the Entente. But there are enough people who are unhappy about Russia that they're quite happy to see Japan do its thing. What I think is a real challenge for Japan is to keep a lid on this war, because actually they do fight a very self-contained war. They're absolutely rigorous about saying this is what we're trying to achieve and this is how we're going to achieve it, and we're going to go no further. I mean, they refused to send men to Europe. They finally agreed to send a flotilla to the Mediterranean in 1917, but it's a token of commitment only. They are simply fighting a war in their own backyard for very limited objectives. And they made quite clear they do that. And of course, you know, their big war aims are in China. They produced the 21 demands in 1915. You know, these powers, I mean, this is why China has to react. This is why China has to be in the war too in 1917, so it can be at the peace settlement.
Thank you.
Super. Thanks for your question there, Michael.
There's a face from the past, Simon.
Hello.
Simon, you're now live. If you want to fire away.
Thank you very much. It's good to see you again, Hugh, after a very long absence.
How long is it? 30 years?
It's knocking on for 40 since I went to Cambridge, Hugh. So unfortunately, I hate to tell you that, but it'll be 41 years next October. So rather 40
I should have
years,
retired. I should have retired.
It'll have been a long time. But I was just obviously very good to see you again, and extremely interesting talk. I'm drawn back to the minefield of July 1914 as ever. And it seems to me there are two contradictory beliefs, and I'm wondering if you can help me square the circle there. That on the one hand, you drew attention to Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers, on it being an accident, a descent into war that no one intended or precipitated and was not inevitable. And yet at the same token, Britain goes to war for very fundamental reasons, moral and strategic reasons, not dissimilar to the ones that prompts a decision to go to war 25 years later. So is it possible to historically square that circle and say that it is both an accident and yet for Britain there are very serious questions to be faced?
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, the dilemma is true in some ways of all these powers, both an accident and serious issues. And I think that you know, in some ways, you know, part of the problem has been the over-determinism about Germany and Germany's ambitions, which when you were at Cambridge was sort of ruled the roost in terms of interpretations. Yeah. But the underestimation of the concerns of the other powers. I mean, and this is a problem even in July 1914 itself. I mean, one of the issues for Gray is that Gray sees Vienna as in Berlin's pocket. It's not, it's taking its own decisions. But he sees Berlin as pulling all the strings here. So the story goes right back to 1914, that he thinks Vienna would not have, I mean, it's true, Vienna might not have behaved like this if Germany had said absolutely no. But Germany's, Germany's taking a punt. It's not doing anything more than that. For Britain, of course, the Belgium issue becomes the reason for going to war. And why that matters, I think, is not for what happens in cabinet, but how it makes the war acceptable to the public at large. What is striking by the beginning of August is that the cabinet's still potentially split on this issue, but the public is saying, gallant little Belgium, they're being invaded by a great big nasty power, and we've got to support them. And for people who think in strategic terms like Gray and Asquith and Haldane, this is absolutely right. I mean, you cannot have an overmighty power in the Low Countries, nor can you afford to lose. I mean, I put it in terms of moral principle, but there is pragmatism here too. If you are currently in a relationship with, sounds like talking about one of one's children or something, you're currently in a relationship with France and Russia, who were your biggest rivals until 1905, 1904, yeah. The biggest thorn of the flesh of the British Empire. And if you don't support them in this crisis, you're going to be exposed again. There's another set of problems further down the line. So there is pragmatic diplomacy and foreign policy going on here too. So that, I think, as ever, so many of these debates, which when presented as either or, become polarized, are actually both and, or in this case, and. That all these factors are playing, which is precisely why it's so complicated.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hugh. It's a delight to see you again.
And you, Simon.
Thanks for your question, Simon. Right, okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I think at just after 9:30, I did promise you that we wouldn't go on beyond 9:30. Keeping to that promise, despite there being any number of questions still unanswered, and looking down the questions, there are some very good questions here. I think that we'll have to call that an evening. So just a couple of things. First of all, if anybody is watching this either live now or subsequently on catch up, if you like, on our YouTube channel, is not a member of the Western Front Association, please do join us. It's only £29 per year, plenty of magazines and other benefits for anybody who wishes to join us. I would invite everybody who's watching to once again to Hugh for his endeavours tonight, and I can say, Hugh, that once again all the hands are electronically going up as a round of applause, so thanks for that. And the WFA webinars continue, so please do, well, I won't list them, but basically just go to the WFA website, just go to the Western Front Association's website, scroll down a little bit the front page, and you'll see all the upcoming webinars listed there. Just click on the page, click on the icon, and then register, and you'll be able to join future events as they weeks and indeed months. So finally, Hugh, sincere thanks once again for a very illuminating presentation tonight. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, as have the hundreds of WFA members who have come along. So thanks very much, and to everybody who's watching, and hope to see everybody in a upcoming webinar. Thanks very much, Hugh. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much, and thank you all for your questions. Sorry not to answer more.
Not at all. Thanks very much. Good evening, everybody. Good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous.